All right, thank you everyone for coming to VettyTalks. Please welcome your host, Garrett Harden.
Hello, everyone. How are we doing today? Well, for those of you that don't know, my name is Garrett. Welcome, everybody, to VettyTalks. VettyTalks is the first live talk show hosted right here in Monterey Bay. My goal for this talk show is to host an open discussion with our guests about their passions, the social issues that affect us today, as well as the artistic culture of Monterey Bay. Our guests are all tied uniquely to the topic of discussion. Now, in today's society, there's far too many opinions and beliefs that have been deemed as wrong, and people are often very quick to use the opposition of their own beliefs to sort of attack others. And it's the justification of this marginalization that has often caused the hostility in our society today. So basically, what this talk show is we're here to listen with open minds and open hearts, okay? I wrote a whole monologue for this, but I completely forgot it. It's going great so far. But basically, we're here to listen and, to heal our society. I truly believe that we need to share our stories and our discussions in a place where we're prone to listen, not react. So I ask that as you listen today, you may not agree with everything. You don't have to, because we all come from different backgrounds and beliefs that shape who we are as people. So I ask that as you listen, reflect on how your life and your circumstances predispose you to what beliefs you have, and I ask that you try to put yourself in the shoes or the perspective of our guest today. So, in the words of, I believe it was Ernest Hemingway, paper's gone, but whatever. So in the words of Ernest Hemingway, when someone's talking, listen completely. Don't be thinking about what you're going to say, because most people never truly listen. So with that said, our first episode is one that really does hold a lot of controversy in the world today. The topic is evolving gender roles in society. Now, So evolving gender roles in society. What this means, it's basically how our society looks at traditional gender roles between men and women and how we are supposed to act in society and how it evolves over time. And depending on these evolving gender roles, they affect how we operate within our family, our job, as well as our personal identity. And today there's a lot of confusion as well as a lot of just arguments in general about what this traditional sort of gender roles really mean today, and how should we follow them, and if we let them define who we are or how other people define us. So we have two very special guests coming in to talk about us today. I'd like to introduce our first guest. She is a great life coach and just motivational figure. Everyone, please welcome Sayra. Thank you for joining us. Hello.
I'm Sayra. Like Garrett said, I love life, and I'm here for this particular awesome discussion.
Yeah.
Oh, but I go by Sayra.
All right. All right, and to introduce our next guest, she is a philosophy professor at CSUMB. Everyone, please welcome Stephanie Spoto.
Thank you, Garrett, for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Hi, Sai.
Hi, Sayra.
All right.
So yeah, my name's Stephanie. I teach philosophy primarily at the university. I also sometimes teach gender theory, and I think that's why you've invited me to come here. But I'm especially excited about the project. So for those of you, I have some friends here in the audience. I love reading groups. I love discussion groups. And this is kind of what this is here, except for in a very beautiful setting,
Yes.
Some really nice cameras. This is awesome. So I got to talk with Sai a little bit backstage, and I'm really excited to see where this conversation goes. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So, that said, basically how this will work is Our two guests will have equal opportunity to speak on sort of each of the issues that we want to discuss, but we'll try to keep this as relaxed as possible. So I guess I'll start with Sayra first. Sayra, how would you define the concept of gender roles? How it means and how it has traditionally been understood by society.
Do you want like a textbook or just like?
I want what you think about it.
Well, if you go by gender, or like gender can't be pretty much, like it could be defined just, by male or female, that's the way I see it. And then the roles, they can be changed at any time. And so, for example, I was telling her in a marriage, a lot of people think that, oh, okay, just because a guy goes and works and is a provider, and if a woman doesn't work and it just stays at home and does the housekeeping roles and whatnot, that if he comes home, like, he shouldn't have to do dishes or all of that. Like, those things right there, I think that we've generalized those as like, oh, female roles, but those don't really have like a gender. Like, you can use whatever to your own liking, and I don't know, it's just, that's the way that I view it. But then, I don't know, we can go on and on and on.
Oh yeah, we'll have plenty of time to go over it. Yeah.
But that's just the way that I see it. But I'm also so excited to get educated in it, since she does teach that class, to, kind of get further into it.
Yeah, all right. Stephanie?
Yeah, really echoing what Sai's saying, right? Why is it that we live in a society where women are expected to do dishes? Now, that's a really good starting question, because it's one in which I think everybody in this room has some kind of relationship to. So why is it that women come home and are expected to do dishes? Whether or not we actually do them or not is a different question. So there's a deeper question here, which is about gender roles. And I have a whole definition here about what it is, but I could say generally we could say it's sort of maybe behaviors or beliefs or expectations that are somehow aligned, as you say, around the male and the female, right? The masculine or the feminine. Now, these behaviors or expectations are things that we sometimes accept, right? We accept that perhaps, some of us might accept that women are natural caregivers, men are natural fighters or doers, but sometimes it's ridiculous, right? Like, gender roles can be as deep as how I talk, how I move my hands, the way I move my hair, the kinds of sex I am taught to sort of seek, the type of hobbies, the types of books I read, the kinds of things that I am taught to think and value about myself. These are gendered. It's so ridiculous that it's like the way I sit is gendered. Now, there's different schools of thought about whether or not this is natural or learned, and I think it might be interesting to have that conversation. But whether or not it's natural or not, we can see the social pressures for gendered behavior every day. And so when I think about gendered roles, it's not just about the kinds of tasks that we do, but also about how we even think about ourselves and how we interact with each other, I think, is also part of gender.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like, especially in today, it's such a controversial issue in the world, and it often makes just a lot of people, especially growing up, really not sure how to define themselves. And so I guess my next question is, in what ways do you see the traditional expectations of masculinity and femininity, how do they really affect sort of the generation growing up today, as well as possibly even the generation who grew up with those more traditional expectations? Because right now I feel like we're in a very unique time period where we have a lot of people with those more old-fashioned values, and that they grew up that way, but at the same time we're in a new age where we are becoming very more progressive. So how do you feel about that? Let's start with Sayra.
Well, like she said, men are naturally providers, and then in order for them to feel in touch with their masculine energy, they have to feel like they're taking care of their family, and then pretty much providing. And then, like, another point that she made is, us women, like, we're naturally caregivers, so we embrace that essence of our feminine and masculine, whatever. But growing up, I remember hearing, you know, tios, tias, or just anybody in general saying, oh, you know what, you can't do this because guys do this, or you can't do this because girls do this, or oh, that's kind of gay or whatnot. Or even now, obviously, if you can't tell, I'm gay. But even now, I always get asked, oh, so who's the man in your relationship? I'm like, what? We're both women. Like, what man are you talking about?
What does that mean to be a man in a relationship?
Yeah, and so obviously there are things that I cannot do that a man can do, and vice versa. And I love being a woman. I love my feminine essence. And just because I dress like this and I'm comfortable, it doesn't mean that I want to be a man. Yeah. And so I don't know. Those are the things that I have kind of learned.
And you've had to adapt to those growing up as well.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Stephanie, how do you feel about this?
Yeah, I feel also growing up, I heard a lot of the same things that you did, right? You can't sit that way, you can't wear that, you can't say those things. So sometimes this comes from media, but sometimes it just comes from members in our own family, like you're talking about members of your own family doing this. And, you know, one of the things, we're talking about how they're evolving over time, you know, one of the things that's really, I think, exciting about young people is how much more open-minded they are. I mean, of course, we live in coastal California here, but, you know, how much more open-minded young people are, I think, than maybe, you know, my generation, you know, the elder millennials in the room, right? That my generation, I thought that we were being very bold in questioning gender roles, and now I see young people today who are being even more creative. And, you know, I think that for a long time, we have, at least in theory, in like sort of theoretical academia, and also, I think, on the streets where there are queer people, really wanted to disconnect the idea of gender from so-called biological sex. So, you know, even back as far as till like 1940s, Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex said, one is not born but becomes a woman. That our gender is not something that we are hardwired in at birth, but it's a kind of series of social constructions that we are conditioned into from a very young age. And we are rewarded when we perform that function well, and we are punished when we don't live up to those expectations. Now, of course, you know, in grad school I read Simone de Beauvoir, but I think it wasn't until I started meeting younger people did it really feel like it was being embodied in people's lives, questioning assigned gender, questioning the roles that come along with those genders. And so, you know, I feel like it's very exciting, you know, I said I teach at the university, and, you know, I have students in my class every semester who are trans or gender or non-binary, and every semester. And one of the things that's exciting for me is there's no script for that. So we're talking about gender roles, we're talking about an assigned script, one that's been passed down from our parents and from their parents, et cetera. And of course it's changed over time, and I'm sure we'll talk about how that's changed. But there's no script, right? If you're genderqueer, if you're non-binary, there's no script for that. So there's a kind of freedom, I think, attached to that. Who am I gonna be? And that doesn't have to be within the confines of man or of woman. What is a human being if we are not hemmed in by those constraints? So that's what I think I'm excited to see when we think about gender roles. I mean, could this be, yes, please, could this be the abolition of gender roles, right? Could this next generation, bring in a world in which we do not necessarily assume that a certain person has a certain kind of cognitive capacity or a certain set of motivations based on how we guess their gender is, right? Or how we perceive their gender. So I'm kind of excited to see what happens. And again, right, I recognize that we are in a very privileged place, right, where we can have this conversation, where trans and non-binary people can walk around with relative safety, not total safety, but relative safety. It would be harder maybe to have this conversation where I'm from, which is Florida, right?
Yeah, it depends on the location as well. And you know, we see that across the world is like all these, like even countries as well, it's like the way that we have so many different definitions of how our gender should act, it really shows the fluidity of both the historical context of it, as like Stephanie said, that there have been philosophies and people have truly believed that we're not defined by these roles since hundreds of years ago, but even more recently, that as a generation, as a society, we've moved towards sort of breaking those condemnations of that. And so I think that is a perfect segue into our next section, historical context and relevance. So my next question for you folks is, what societal factors and historical influences have played a significant role in reshaping gender dynamics over time? Let's start with Stephanie.
So I am a bit of a Marxist, which means I'm looking at material conditions. So what is actually happening? How are resources being distributed? How are people making their money, and how are people working? And how is this going to influence gender? The idea that we think of as femininity, what is a feminine woman, this is pretty recent. Like, this probably only goes back, and almost everything I'm saying is like a Euro-American context. I also want to say, I'm not talking about gender roles in indigenous communities or, in Korea. But when we think about what does it mean to be a woman in a Euro-American context, this is largely influenced by Victorian values. So it's like pretty recent, right? So like values like chastity, like meekness, submissiveness. Okay, first of all, I just want to say these are not feminine values. These are values of oppression, all right? So if we are told that to be a woman, we need to be X, Y, and Z, we need to think about why are we being asked to take on those characteristics. So also we can think about the idea of the housewife, right, enshrined in the home. Again, right, a Victorian value, which really only became solidified in American society after World War II. During the wars, there were not men to work in the factories. So guess who built all of the machines? Guess who worked in all of those jobs? It was women. Now, when men came back from the war, there was a huge propaganda campaign through the media to convince women, I should say, to get out of the factories and back into the home. So you look at advertising, you look at movies, you look at film, you look at celebrities. What are they trying to do? What kind of messages are they trying to show us? Well, women should be beautiful, they should be objects to be seen, they should be primarily domestic. I think that one thing that is pretty constant through time is a kind of division between public life and private life. So, I mean, we can even go back to ancient Rome and we can see that even though women worked, I mean, poor women have worked always, right? That primarily the idea of men being in the public sphere, women being in the private sphere is pretty long lasting. But what that looks like specifically in terms of the housewife is pretty recent. And it's not natural, right? There's nothing natural about this position of women. We had to be taught to do this, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, and like you said, is that propaganda has a big part of why we believe what we do, and a lot of people choose especially in this age, of what propaganda or what news sources they do choose to follow. And so I also think that greatly influences how we view the world, and that our beliefs are influenced by both our life experiences, but also what's around us and what we're hearing every day. And so that really drives into us, just sort of how we feel about others, and it's not always true, and like we can see that today. So my question for Sayra is, especially in a more modern day, we see that this propaganda of evolving gender roles, and that especially after World War II, where the men came back basically expecting to have their jobs back, because that sort of defines gender role as like men are supposed to be the money makers of the family. So I guess in today's society, how does the role of media how is that involved in promoting one side or another, and what changes are kind of going into that today?
Steph and I, we were having a conversation before the show started, and I was telling her about how, I think it was on a dating show that I saw it, or I can't remember exactly where, but it was about I think it was a dating show, and women were asking, or men were asking women and vice versa, and the woman asked the man, what do you have to offer or to bring to this relationship besides your money? And then the man was like, well, what do you have to offer besides your beauty? And then right then and there, I kind of started thinking, and I was like, wow, like this world is really teaching us to become objects, and to that, you know, obviously you have the value of however much money you make, or, you know, whatever your beauty, and vice versa. And then I think sometimes we really need to be careful with what we see and watch on social media, because obviously nowadays the economy is changing. Women are forced to go out and work and, you know, be providers as well. But then again, there are also those expectations of men of like, oh, you should be able to provide and do all these things. And then sometimes if they can't really do it, they should also be able to have, you know, the free will to communicate and ask for help, and not feel embarrassed or not feel like they're not, you know, that much of a man because they're asking for help. And I think you and I, we've even had those conversations of, you know, we all want the same thing, but it looks different. And it would just be resolved if we could all communicate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. So really, and a big part of this as well is like how we're educated as a society, because, you know, me growing up, and I grew up personally in a very conservative town, even though it was in Sacramento. You know, coming here, I realized I was blindsided to a lot of the social issues about gender roles and race that I had no idea before. And, you know, that's definitely a location thing as well, I feel, is like, because not all school systems have the same education, and we're not providing that same level of really just information to students as we should. And so coming to the CSU Monterey Bay has definitely, as sort of a more progressive school, it's opened me up definitely into a lot of it. So I guess my question, I'll start with Stephanie for this, is how has education played a role in promoting gender equality and altering social perceptions of traditional gender roles?
I would like to say that it has, right? In an ideal world, right, education is about liberation of consciousness from social conditioning. I primarily see K through 12 education as a way to get us into and comfortable with gender roles, and to get us into a system and accept it. I mean, I could also talk about K through 12 education as like a babysitting service, so that now women can go and be exploited by capitalists as well, right? Hooray, now women can sell their labor like men can, and we can all be exploited under capitalism. Aren't we all thrilled about that? Now, in order for this to happen, we need to have a state babysitting service. And like, I don't know what your education was like, but if we sat still, if we didn't talk back, if we learned to read and write, and if we can stay in one place for 8 hours, whoop, pass on to the next level. And then after that, right, you go to college, you go to the military, or you go into work. Now, presumably, you know, we all get the same education, but I have lots of stories, not only of me, but other women, really being discouraged from things like math and science, which are now seen to be, and have for a while seen to be, very masculine pursuits, and kind of funneled into things like the humanities, which are traditionally seen. If any academia is considered a feminine pursuit, it's the humanities, really. So yeah, you know, I would like to think that, you know, education can be this mechanism for liberation, but theoretically, yes. Historically, no.
Do you feel like people, like, because we've established that not all education across the board is going to be the same in terms of how much they focus on a certain issue. Like, they can bring it up, but it doesn't mean they'll really bring up the relevance of why that issue is. So do you feel like, you know, when kids growing up, they receive their education on an issue, do you feel like if it's not fully in depth, does that create almost a sort of confident perception, even though it's false, in these students and in these kids growing up, just because they're not fully educated upon the historical relevance and what those issues really mean?
I think yes, right? Like, the history that we get is very surface. I mean, women's history, like what was that? The suffrage movement, that was it. Like, I think that's the only women's history I got in school. And it was like, yes, now we've won. We've done it. Hooray, feminism. We've achieved equality. Now we can vote. We did it, kind of a thing. And talking about the superficiality, I don't know if that's a word, of this, yes, it sweeps under the rug a whole bunch of other issues. Now, it's also hard to say, I don't want to say that girls are oppressed in school, because we also know that boys really struggle in school. So it isn't just an issue that girls struggle and boys are doing great, because we can look across the board and there's a whole host of problems that are affecting boys and girls, but they affect them differently, right? So in the same way that girls are struggling in school, also, right, boys are struggling. So I'm not trying to just say, oh, girls have it hard and boys have it great, in a sense. And this is one of the great contributions of recent feminism, is that no longer are we thinking about the feminist battle as like women against men. We're thinking about it now that all people are oppressed under patriarchy. They're just oppressed differently under patriarchy. Yeah.
Okay. Sarah, how do you feel about this?
Well, when I was in school, I thought I was the worst student, or that I didn't know, but really, I have a very, like, I just need to understand why. So I would always kind of ask questions. And then I realized as I got to the college level, it wasn't that I was dumb or whatnot, but there was a lot of teachers that shouldn't have been teaching anymore, and they should have retired and let other people that really do have the passion to teach. And I think that I really agree with, you know, some of the things that you're saying. And I was telling her earlier that I would be interested to sit in one of her classes and kind of just learn a little bit. And now I have another question. Obviously, like you say, you teach a feminist class. How, like, what are like some of the interesting like key points that you teach and you talk about in that class?
It's a college class, so I get to do a lot of things that you can't do in K through 12 education. So this week we're talking about what is called the feminist sex wars, which were in the 1970s and 80s, which is really asking a question, can there be such a thing as feminist pornography? Now this gets into something very deep, and it's the kind of conversation you can have in a college classroom that you can't really have in an elementary school classroom, you know? So I'm really glad that I can have conversations with adults. I don't have to censor myself, right? That would be really hard.
Hey, I'd attend that class.
Well,
Is there a feminist porn?
I mean, that's a very, very hot topic.
hot indeed. So we'll jump.
3 puns in there.
We'll jump next into personal experiences and stories, because, you know, we all have sort of unique stories and backgrounds growing up that really shape how we view these issues. So I guess we'll start with Sayra on this one. Is you know, what's your story, and like, well, not your whole life story. It's only a 90-minute show, but you know, share a bit of your personal journey of, you know, how have you personally, how has your gender role sort of you've seen it evolve over a lifetime, but also the people around you, and sort of, you know, that influence towards yourself of how it makes you feel?
Well, obviously, I was brought up to think, oh, you're gonna marry a man. You have to cater to your husband and do all these things that every single other, like, female that is part of my family has done. And then, whoops, surprise, Sade, I'm nothing like they are.
So what was the point, I guess, of when did you really start questioning that these gender roles that you were being presented?
Well, obviously, I might be the wrong kind of gay to ask that, Garrett, because I still am very traditional, even though I'm gay. But I think probably it wasn't up until I was in my later 20s that I was, and then now that I was able to have, you know, conversations with my parents, or even seeing, oh, well, women are supposed to serve men, and you do this, vice versa. And then now I think with my parents, they've kind of changed that, because then all of a sudden it's like, "Ooh, we don't want to offend the gay or whatnot," and so they serve me, so it's kind of helped, like not only me but helped them kind of learn. And obviously from when I first came out to now, things are so different. Well, yeah.
Was there ever a time in your life where you felt uncomfortable with being gay?
I think yes, before I truly accepted myself. Like, obviously, I would always say like, oh, this would probably be more comfortable if I was born a man. But then I was like, I don't even want to be a man. They stink.
That's true.
And so then, obviously, like, I'm comfortable with, and it wasn't until I accepted myself for who I really am that everything started changing and life started changing. And then instead of seeking for, oh, the love of my life, I realized that I am the love of my life and I have to love my life. And then I think that's when things started changing and I started realizing like no one would accept me until I accept myself.
Accepting yourself for not your gender or what
But just
role
for what,
that
who I am.
society says you should be, but how you really want to feel and love yourself.
Yeah. I think we all just ultimately want the same thing, and is to be happy and to be loved, but you can't be happy or loved until you give that to yourself.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
I like that.
Stephanie, how about you? Do you have a personal story that has sort of influenced you or changed your mind of, a traditional way that you might have thought?
I think being a woman and as kind of bold and crass as I am, I do often kind of come up against resistance to that. But I think that one of the things that's different about people who are my age versus people who are younger, and I was thinking about this when you're thinking about like, well, I don't want to be a man, but like, what is it? Like, what does it mean to be a woman in a sense? And now, like, if I was 19 or 20, I might say something like, well, do I even need to be a woman? I mean, when I was 19 or 20, that wasn't even an option. Like, you didn't really have a choice in your gender. So what I did, and what maybe it seems like you kind of did a little bit too, was we just decided we're just going to broaden the definition about what it means to be a woman, right? So rather than saying, okay, this is what it means to be a woman, I'm going to say, all right, and maybe all of this other stuff over here as well. And now, of course, we can still do that, but we have all these other options as well, I think, too. Yeah.
Let's see. In navigating non-traditional gender roles, have there been any challenges that either of you have faced?
Probably just the whole, like, because I dress like this because this is what I feel comfortable. Everybody assumes that I want to be a man. Probably just that's it. Or they'll always think like, oh, well, you want to do all these things that men want to do. I know I don't.
Do you feel that you get treated differently based off of how you dress?
Sometimes. I've been into the women's restroom and they'll be like, oh, at work, there's a man going in there. And then I'll turn around in there and act all gay, like, where? So I play along with it. But that's about it. Other than that, no, I don't really feel, or maybe I just don't take things personal, or I'll try to understand, like, well, why are they saying this? So then I think that this is where I'm still trying to figure out where did the they, them started. Because at work, people will ask me, like, well, or customers, well, what are your pronouns? And I'm like, well, what is that? Like, and I didn't even know about any of that until, just recently. And then, so I'm still trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
But other than that, no, I wouldn't say.
Okay.
I love being a woman, Garrett.
Stephanie, how about you?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. In navigating non-traditional gender roles, have you faced any challenges, in really navigating that? Or if you've had successes, what successes have you celebrated?
I used to want to be in a very different place in my career than I am now. I now take where I am at the university I am and at the level I am as a blessing, right? I don't want to be at one of those other universities that are super competitive. I love CSUMB for how chill it is. I think for a while I would think things like, oh, if I was a man, people would just see me as a thinker, as a philosopher. They wouldn't think of what I'm doing as what I'm thinking as somehow filtered through the screen of my gender. Where it's like, oh, you're just thinking that because you're a woman. It's like, well, okay, did you ever think that maybe you just think that because you're a man, you know? And I think that in general, sometimes people don't believe me, right? If I'm like, oh, I have a PhD and I teach at the university, sometimes people just don't believe me, right, when I say that. But I think that if I think about my own successes, and I know we're going to talk about intersectionality later, but I need to also think about all the privileges that I have, right? Like my racial privilege, my class privilege, and how for me, it's easier for me to overcome gender depression than it is for somebody who's like a person of color or who's disabled or who's working class, right? So like, yes, of course, as women, right, we share that gender depression, but our struggles are not all the same in a sense, I think, as well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, at this time, we'd like to get some audience participation. Does anyone have their own stories of a moment in your life where you've been challenged by traditional gender roles, and have you overcome those, and how have you overcome those? If you guys don't go, I will. I'll start. Okay. So I feel like for me, I'm still pretty young. I'm only 20 years old, and the past 3 years in college have probably been the biggest years of growth for me. I remember being in 6th or 7th grade, and the boys would call me gay just based off of how I dressed, and it would be a joke, and it made me very uncomfortable as a kid growing up. I'm like, that's not what I want to be defined as. That it feels like an insult. It feels like no one would want to be like that. And now, today it's like, okay, who cares? I go to school with a million other people who are comfortable with themselves, no matter what it be. But I think growing up, especially in the town that I grew up in, and I still define myself as straight, but I think that just the fact that you could be labeled as that, and that label itself sort of gave a negative connotation to where you would be picked on and bullied for something that you weren't even, which directly relates to gender roles in society. Is like you're being picked on or you're being subjugated to something that, one, you probably didn't have a choice in, and two, if it's really how you feel or who you are, why should you be picked on for like that? And even today, it's like I've been told, I have a more feminine side to me, and I've come to accept that that's just who I am, that's just how I hold myself. And for me, it's being able to grow up and put myself in social scenarios where it's like you cross your legs as a guy. It can be taken one way, or it can just be taken as a gesture of comfort. And I think that there's a great level of immaturity growing up, especially in schools today, where like you guys said, it's like any minuscule thing can be taken as one way or the other, and just based off that, people will start getting into their own heads and really judging you when they know nothing about you, just based off of what they see and what they hear, or the tone of your voice. I think the tone of a voice is a huge thing as well. It's like, we're not all men are born with a deep masculine voice, and not all women are born with, this high-pitched, pretty voice. It's all mixed because we're all different people, and it's a shame to see that, growing up, that a lot of kids, especially myself, would be uncomfortable, for those, for just the physical aspects of themselves. And another thing that I've always, had trouble was with my body hair. I remember growing up in high school, and people would point out, wow, you have like tons of leg hair and arm hair. And at that time, I didn't really know what that meant. Like for me, it felt like am I growing up too fast? Why am I just still want to stay like a young kid and, be shaven. And I feel like growing up later, that sort of made me look into why did I feel like I needed to follow all these other kids and, just because they're comments of me. So that's sort of, and then coming to college and taking these classes with Stephanie and, really speaking with more people who have become comfortable with themselves made me realize that a lot of it is just, where I grew up and the society itself that I grew up in. So, yeah.
Well, if we're going to start going on and telling personal stories, I got to say that as an educator in an elementary and middle school, I think what it really takes in order to cultivate an actual open atmosphere is constant and permanent vigilance towards that, right? Because there is so much of our society that's going to try and crush that down, especially here in a pretty conservative town in the general sense.
You got a mic, all right, cool.
Love the mic.
Appreciate it. So I work at a school over in Pacific Grove. Pacific Grove is this like small, super conservative town with this incredible like religious background that really helps to paint its culture in a lot of these different ways. And we work really hard in order to actually like cultivate an atmosphere that's open to like queerness and the expression of one's own sort of like attempted gender affirmations. And I say attempted because, this is like elementary and middle school kids who are really trying to like discover themselves in a world that is going to like demonize them for doing that because they're going to call the culture like sexualizing kids, when in reality it's just trying to help like young people guide themselves to their own like awakening, whatever it is that means, in their own like personal self and their own personal way of being. And so for instance, I can't name any names obviously, but last year there was a trans kid who actually spoke to us and let us know like, hey, I'm trans, don't tell my parents. And they felt more comfortable speaking with us as a school than they did their own family. And when you look at situations like Spreckles, where there were a couple of teachers who got in a lot of trouble for having an LGBTQ club, right? When you look at situations like that, there's an enormous community backlash and this assumption that teachers are pushing kids to be queer as opposed to an understanding that they already are. They're just not in a position to talk to adults about it because adults are trying to crush that down so much because it's so ingrained within our society. So I think as we build a community where things like that are allowed, you do wind up having a lot more queer kids coming out. And what that means is you have a lot more openness and a lot more passion and a lot more joy that's just generally happening because people are allowed to be precisely who it is that they want to be. And as this starts happening, it kind of begins to shape the atmosphere of the space that you're in, turning the place into a generally more positive place as a town or as a city or a state or any variation thereof. And I think these things are important. Yeah. That's all I have to say about that.
All right. Thank you. Anyone else? All right. Well, with that said, we're going to take a 10-minute intermission right now. If you'd like, I'll be playing one of my old documentaries that I made for school. It's called Nitwit Ridge. But yeah, thank you all. We'll be back in 10 minutes with VettyTalks. Thank you.
Damn, bro, I wish I would have gone to your elementary school.
I made up that name. I have no idea what it means.
It's like vetting something, like when you vet something.
I've heard that. I genuinely made it like out of the blue, and yeah. So I kind of let it make its own meaning, and I'll continue to let Vetty sort of make its own meaning as my film career goes on. And I mean, part of me is like my film journey is I really want to bring light to a lot of issues that people aren't talked about, or like for me, example. I grew up in the Boy Scouts of America, and a lot of things that weren't talked about or that just really aren't highlighted in news or anything is a lot of kind of like the sexual assault and just like especially the atmosphere within the boys themselves, like going on camping trips. You didn't always feel safe going on these camping trips just because even with fellow kids your age, and there wasn't much you could really do about it to sort of go against it. But at the same time, there was also just a lot of corruption in the world that I am learning to see with my own eyes. And I was fired from the Boy Scouts of America because I brought up OSHA violations that our Boy Scout camp was breaking, and I decided to speak up on those violations at a staff meeting, and in retaliation, they fired me. And so, that really drove me to not only wanting to make a story of what seems impossible possible, of, going after one of the most corrupt or one of the biggest, heftiest organizations in America, but also bringing to light an issue that most people are completely blindsided to and they don't really know too much about. So yeah, that's sort of my journey of, where I want to go from here on out, especially starting this talk show of, really opening up to more perspectives and ideas, whether it be, something more serious and relevant to the world's today as a social issue like evolving gender roles, or one of our future episodes, or our second episode, we have the Bluetooth poet in the back, who will be speaking on, life and art and poetry, and how expressing ourselves through different means and art can really help us understand who we are, because it's helped me understand who I am. So yeah. Well, anyways, I'm gonna run to the bathroom real quick. You guys can watch a video.
That's great.
All right. Unmuted? Cool. All right, 3, 2, 1. Welcome everyone back to VettyTalks. The topic of today is evolving gender roles in society. Our next segment for today, we'll be discussing gender roles in relationships and families. So, to start us off, let's start off with Sayra on this question. How do evolving gender roles influence romantic relationships, and what changes have you observed in how couples navigate these roles?
Well, for example, both of my brothers are married, and both their wives are very successful in what they do, and obviously they both have gone back to school and they have kids, so now my brothers have had to fill in some of those roles of cooking dinner, picking the kids up, doing, a lot of things that in a traditional Mexican household, men back in the day, they wouldn't have done. But then again, we're lucky to have, the father that we have, because he was also very involved, and, whether it was doing the laundry, washing dishes, or filling in, and not necessarily picking up something that is has a gender or whatever, whatnot. It was just a role of the household. And so just seeing that and seeing them, it has really opened up my eyes, and seeing that there are still a lot of men that don't do this, or there's a lot of women that don't have the luxury to be able to go to school or do all these things because they don't have supportive significant others and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So that's how I see it.
Okay. Stephanie, how about you?
Yeah, I think that one of the things about gender roles is they have pre-prescribed positions and expectations attached to them. And so you can get into a relationship with somebody, and this is incredibly common in heterosexual relationships, where it's like you get into a relationship and you have expectations before you even have a conversation. What do we expect from each other? How do we want to divide up labor? We don't talk about that because it's built into gender roles. It's built into the way our society has already decided how we're going to act. So who gets to make decisions? Who gets to sort of decide what that relationship is going to look like? It doesn't really seem like it's encouraged to be us. It seems like we're encouraged to kind of give up that freedom and that autonomy to a system that we've been kind of born into. Now, relationships can be infinitely diverse, but we're not really sort of inspired to kind of do that. Now, it seems like you were pretty lucky in some senses where you got to see like non-normative gender roles in action in your family, and I got to kind of open your eyes a little bit. And I think to some extent we all have examples in our families where that happens. Hopefully those examples are celebrated and they're not seen as shameful in the family, certainly, yeah.
Yeah, I feel that, personally in romantic relationships, and especially in the generation that I am in, is that there's a lot of, evolving pressure on, how just men and women should treat each other in a relationship, as well as like it comes down to even like, who makes the first move, who's expected to reach out first, and is it even like okay? Or I guess it's sort of been kind of casted down upon that, not many boys or men around my age feel comfortable about, expressing to a woman, oh, you look very beautiful today. Like, can I ask you out to somewhere? And, I feel like, there's a lot of just negative pressure that, it's not okay to do that anymore, because it's either sexist or it goes against this evolving sort of progressive way that we're starting to look at gender roles. And so I guess the big thing for me is like, how to navigate that myself is, what is now okay, and like what's like, how do we still, like what gray area are we in right now where we need to be conscious of what's happening, but also like we still want to, like I personally am more of an old-fashioned romantic, and and it's also just that battle of just like hookup culture as well, is because so many people today are no longer interested in romantic relationships at all, and I think that the way we define of having a significant other in our lives has changed as well, to where having a significant other used to mean having a title or even being married to that point for certain religions in certain areas. And now it's sort of confusing, I guess, to be in search of something either more or less than a romantic relationship, and actually defining that for what that is. So how do you feel about that?
Well, do you think people are looking for more of like relations instead of relationships? And then the same thing, I see it obviously because I'm in the serving industry, and especially when they're on their first date or whatnot, when it comes time to paying the check, is I've seen it where they split the check and then, surprise, no second date. And then I've seen it where, like women are expecting for the guy to pick up the check, or I've seen it where, certain females don't want to be taken care of like that. They are independent, so they feel like they want to pay. But I think this is another thing too, how do you draw the line, or where do you have those boundaries or whatnot? And the same thing is just, you have to ask yourself, are you looking for a relationship or just relations? And the same thing, could you approach a woman and just say, hey, I really want to take you out on a date, but I don't have any money. Like, would you be down to just do like a free date and go on a walk? Yeah. I bet you for a man, that's a big, big pressure, and you can't really be honest and say those things to someone, because then they look at you like, oh, well, you have no value. You have nothing to bring to this relationship because you have no money. But in reality, it's not that you don't have any money, but you have responsibilities of things that you have to take care of, and you're not going to go and spend lavishly. But then again, you have to, I don't know, draw the line.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like as well, it's like there's, as a guy, and, you have these ways that, you'd like to treat your significant other, and a lot of those do tie into the conventions of gender role, like opening doors, but also just how you act socially. And I think that there's an evolving way of, how I guess women treat men in relationships today as well, as like, You know, some don't want to be treated at all like their property, or even that they're tied to the significant other, that they're completely equal. And I feel like that almost puts pressure on the man's side, or it's like, well, okay, so what's okay to do now? How can I, like, what's the line or the extent that I can still be myself and still want to treat this person how I feel is romantically acceptable, but at the same time, like, be sensitive to their issues if they're not communicative about it, you know? Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that, Stephanie?
I think that you really hit it when you said being sensitive to how they're seeing things. So we've had our gender roles challenged. We're seeing that in the 21st century, things don't mean the same things that they used to mean. So that somebody might think that it means something for me to pay for your dinner. It means something for me to ask to split the check. But what that means to me might be very different than what it means to somebody else. So at the same time, while our pre-prescribed roles that were safe, they were known, we all agreed culturally what these things meant, those things are being obliterated. And I don't think that's a bad thing, which gives us a lot of freedom, right? But unfortunately, we haven't been given the communication skills to then talk through this like new infinite world. I can't just assume that when somebody pays for my dinner that means the same thing to them as it does to me anymore. Or when somebody opens the door for me, what does that mean to them versus me? If someone asks me out, what does that mean for them? What does that mean for me? We are not even in a culture of monogamy anymore. We can't even assume that of our partner. It's not like I'm saying we should, but that is another sort of thing that was once so set and so certain that we have certain expectations that now we don't have those expectations. We have the situationship. What even is that, right? If we don't talk about that, if we don't have a clear way to kind of communicate through it, it becomes murky and it becomes painful and traumatic instead of what it could be, which is like amazing and liberatory. But that requires conversation, that requires difficult conversations. And I don't know about you, but the media that I consume does not give me a lot of models for that. I don't see a lot of healthy communication in the media that I consume between people in romantic relationships.
Yeah. Well, with that topic said as well, how can we can you provide any insights into building healthy and balanced relationships in the context of changing gender roles? Sayra.
I think the most important one is building a relationship with yourself and, you know, what you value and what's important to you. And obviously for you still like courting people the old school way of opening doors and whatnot. So really just look within yourself and see, okay, these are my values, these are my morals, this is what I'm willing to compromise on, this is what I'm not. And just kind of looking to see who you're gonna date and what if they're interested in the same things. And you know, obviously, those are some of the things that I had to check in with myself, you know, before I started dating again. And I think that's important, you know, and that's how anybody is gonna obviously get, for the most part, a successful relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely, 100%, right? We check in with ourselves. What does it mean to me if I pay for somebody's dinner? Does it mean that they owe me something? Does it mean that I'm showing them that I value their time so much and respect them? Is it a signal of my commitment? Is it a signal of my interest? Now, we figure that out for ourselves. That's what we got to do. What do these things mean for us, these things that we like and that we want to do? And then we have to figure out a way to communicate that. Because if you're very adamant that you want to buy someone dinner and they're like, I don't want that, I mean, that could be a miscommunication that could end things. Because somebody might say, oh, I feel like you're trying to buy me dinner. This feels like a weird transaction. I don't really like that. Or I don't want to feel beholden to you. Whereas for you, it's not about that at all. That's not what it means for you. So until we figure out what that means for ourselves, and until we can communicate that in like a loving, open way, this world of freedom is gonna be chaotic and not in a good way, right? We want a little good chaos, But this chaos could become pretty painful, I think, for a lot of people.
When do you feel like that communication should come into play when, trying to start a relationship with someone? Because, like we talked about, gender roles can be identified with opening doors or even just things with simply first meeting the person. So when do we really dig into that communication of, what are we both comfortable with?
Yeah, I mean, right away, right? Like, how would you feel if I took you for dinner, right? How would you feel if I treated you for dinner? Like, what does that mean to you? This is what it means to me. I'd like to take you to dinner because X, Y, and Z. This is the kind of meaning or significance that I hold to that. Now, we don't oftentimes have the confidence or even the self-awareness, I think, is really what you're talking about, to be able to even articulate that to ourselves, let alone to others, right? So yeah, we've got to start where Say's starting, which is we have to interrogate our own values and the meanings that we attach to actions before we can try to lovingly communicate that to others, I think.
And a lot of it could be like, there's a lot of women that, are really independent, and they're just like, well, I could pay for it myself or whatnot. Or the same thing, just, hey, like, let's go grab a bite to eat. Are you comfortable with splitting the check, or do you prefer that I pay? How do you normally like to do it? Those are the first things that you have to pretty much establish before you even think about asking them on a date, bro.
Yeah. And that also builds up, I feel, a level of comfort with that other person. Like, oh, this person is actually thinking about more than just, wanting to get in my pants. They're actually considering how I'm feeling about the entire way this goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we don't talk about the motivation behind things, we can get kind of stuck. Like, the thing that we want to communicate when we take someone for dinner is that we want to communicate a kind of intentionality, a kind of commitment, or a kind of seriousness. Now, if somebody's like, I don't want you to take me to dinner, like, I feel weird about that, and they don't know why you want to go to dinner, then that need's never going to get met. So if you're like, I'd like to take you for dinner because I'm serious about you, then somebody could say, well, I'm really serious about you too. That's why I want to go halfway. Well, now you've both established that you're serious about each other. So who cares who pays, in a sense, right? The need is being met, the meaning is communicated, and then you can kind of go forward from there, I think. I mean, I probably shouldn't be talking, but that's what I think.
I liked how you said that. Yeah. All right, well, I guess we'll jump into our next section then. Our next section is intersectionality and inclusivity. So, for our first question is, intersectionality is an important aspect of gender roles. Could you sort of explain what it means and, how it affects individuals' experiences as gender roles evolve? Stephanie.
So we're talking about intersectionality. We're really kind of building off of the theoretical work of Kimberly Crenshaw. And she was looking at legal cases and how legal cases of discrimination, so if you were a black woman and you were being discriminated against, the judge or the sort of lawyer would be like, okay, well, were you being discriminated against because you were black, or were you being discriminated against because you were a woman? And they wanted to say, well, both, right? And that there's something specific about that position. And Bell Hooks describes it really well in her work, Cultural Criticism as Transformation, where she says, okay, look, I could think about myself, this is her talking, right? I could think about myself as a woman, and I could learn a lot about myself looking at myself through that lens. I could look at myself as a black person, and I could learn a lot about myself through that lens. But there's something particular about the coming together of identities of blackness and womanness that is different than those two things on their own. So I can think about myself as a white person, and in the same way, right? I could learn a lot about myself if I look at myself through that lens. I could look at myself through the lens of womanness. But there's something specific, right, about white women and the cultural positioning of white women that is different than if we take those two identities separately. So intersectionality asks us not just to look at race and gender, but all things like nationality, class privilege, ability, all kinds of things together, and to say, how do these things stack together to give me a certain kind of intersectional position in society? Now, some of these positions, intersecting positions, are going to give us privilege. Some of them are going to oppress us in society, but it's that kind of rainbow that comes together, and we can't really think about them as like individual things that are on separate nodes. We need to think about how they all come together.
Sayra, for you, could you discuss some of the challenges, faced by marginalized communities and, how they face gender roles differently?
Well, pretty much like how she said, I've having to think of yourself not only as a Latina, but just as a person, and seeing how just kind of sectionalizing, kind of just based on what she said. I mean, I don't think I could add anything more to that.
Yeah, no worries. Let's see. So I guess another question for you, Sayra, is, what initiatives or actions can, people take to sort of create a more inclusive society with each other, both, in a community as small as a restaurant or, in a community larger, more as a city or as a school as well?
I think just respect each other and treat each other equally. And then, I don't know, maybe I view things differently, or just because I've accepted myself, that I don't really jump to, like maybe 10 years ago, I would have been in a different, like, oh, they're attacking me or all these things. But I think now I see it differently. And now instead of like, okay, let's all work together, like, let me educate you on these things and talk, communication. I think communication is key.
Or also, I guess, understanding that, emotions that can come out in these kind of conversations is that when we do have these conversations, we need to be acknowledging that, these all people that we talk to all come from different backgrounds as well. And, we don't know their backgrounds, we only know what they're presenting to us. And so in that manner is that we have to keep ourselves as open as possible. And, it comes to a point where if they're not able to allow their own emotionalness to sort of underlie what they really believe and what they're really thinking, to have an open discussion like we are today, is, we can't really engage in that kind of discussion because it's just not possible. You're not at that point, you're no longer trying to change a perspective or a mind or even open someone else up to a perspective. It's simply just yelling at each other what you both think, and you're not going to change it either way. In fact, people generally leave the conversation more at odds with the other side than they originally started. So
I think how you said in the beginning of the show is just to listen to each other and to really try to understand, and to really, instead of thinking of giving someone a response, like how you said, is just really take it all in and learn. I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah. Stephanie, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, Sai said it, right? Mutual respect, right? That's everything. And I remember I was reading Angela Davis recently, and she said that the only way our movements can go forward is if we see the person in front of us as like an equal partner in a struggle for collective liberation. That it's not me versus you, that we are all in a struggle together against the forces of patriarchy, capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy, and that we all differently are negatively impacted by these forces. Now, if I start to see that my struggle is more important than your struggle, we've already lost, right? Yeah.
Do you think that there is no more like or like we're veering away from like sisterhood and like brotherhood, and everybody's like, oh, well, my struggle is more important than yours, and then vice versa, and then we're all turning kind of against each other instead of listening and learning? Do you think that's happening nowadays?
It's like a classic method of like the rulers of oppression, right? Where it's like we can divide and conquer. If we can get people to not see how much they would benefit by working together, if we can keep them in their own separate struggles, then, right, we're less, like, the ruling class is going to be less in danger, right, of seeing all of the different systems of oppression that they've been setting up and that they've benefited from, right? They're less in danger of seeing those things crumble.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Right now, we're going to open the floor to the audience. If you have any questions that you'd like either to ask myself or our guests today on some insights of our topic today, would anyone like to, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
So one thing I've noticed is that people will often identify with those sections themselves in their intersectional, like, individualism, like nature, that are least oppressed. So, for example, a white woman might identify as white, and there's pressure to do so over being a woman. Or a white gay man might identify with being white or having wealth over being gay or queer. Because those are the things that they've still internalized shame about. It's just an observation, but it's like something you have to like actively think about, particularly if you are in a position of privilege. It's like, it's very rare that everyone is in a dominant position in every single way. But it's hard for them to see that. I mean, there's like these nuances, like being a man subjugates you to patriarchy in a way, but that's invisible because being a man is the apex of being in the patriarchy. Anyway.
Thank you. No, thank you. We have about time for one more question. Does anyone else have a question?
Paige, you had a question?
Yeah, Paige has a question.
As a professor in the time and day that we live in, how do you like deal with people who have different opinions in your classes? Because like we were just saying, you have to listen, not to just respond, but to understand the person. So how do you as a teacher kind of help them do that and not disrespect either sides of it?
It really depends on what mood I'm in. I'll say that, right?
In college, it's like you're in charge.
Let them fight.
Yeah.
Like the impression you want to leave on them and to leave your class with without them feeling unheard or disrespected, you know.
So it depends on what kind of mood I'm in. I could be in the mood where I'm like, that view is terrible. I don't even want that spoken in my class, right? I don't even think you should subject my other students to whatever abhorrent crap's gonna come out of your mouth. And there are other times where maybe I'm feeling more gracious.
But aren't we like half the problem when we think like that, like shutting them down?
And there's other times where I'm feeling more gracious and I feel like I want to ask, okay, well, like tell me about that for you. Where does that come from inside of you, in a sense? Now, you know, it doesn't normally feel like confronting to some deeper part of me. And this has to do with power, right? Because in the classroom, I have power. So I get to decide what views get spoken and what views don't get spoken. And so being in that position of power, I think, gives me maybe a kind of calmness, and maybe it actually makes me more gracious than I might be than if I was just on the street with somebody who doesn't really care about my views or doesn't really see me as somebody who can be in like a kind of position of intellectual respect or something. But because, you know, my students generally see me as somebody with a certain kind of wisdom or knowledge, I feel like that allows me to be a little more open with them. Because, yeah, you know, I also get into fights, I mean, not like physical fights anymore, but, you know, I do sometimes also get into arguments at bars, right? And I'm a lot less gracious in those contexts than I am in the classroom. I think there's also like kind of responsibility to my students that I don't necessarily feel to like the random person on the street as well. Like they're coming to me because something that I've said is rubbing them in a way that is challenging them, and maybe that question doesn't come out very well or very compassionately, but it's still a question, right? And very, very rarely do I really feel like my students are just trying to be jerks, right? And so since I think most of my students, even if they have annoying questions, I think it comes from like a real, honest, genuine place. It allows me to also respond from that place as well, you know. Worst comes to worst, as is what I was saying. I could be like, that's a really good question. We have a lot of material to get through. I would love to talk with you about this after class, right?
I wish you would have been my women's studies.
Shove it to the side.
I wish you would have been my women's studies professor. I got kicked out.
Aw.
I did. I got kicked out. They were talking about, I think it was something about, I don't know if it was domestic violence or whatnot, but it was like if you were to see someone in the streets being upset, like a woman or like a guy hitting a woman, like would you step in? And I was like, well, I wouldn't. But not because I don't care, but I don't know exactly what is going on. And then what if I go over there and I get beat up too? Like, I need to stay in my lane. And then so I think that rubbed her the wrong way. And she said, get out. And I was like, okay, bye. But then again, I was, probably like 18, 19. I was much younger. I thought, you're always supposed to stay in your lane, so.
I mean, it's also okay to be concerned about your own safety.
Yeah.
Like, that is okay.
She didn't care about my safety. She kicked me out. And I was like, this is just a scenario, lady.
She said throw him in the ring, I mean.
And I was like, well, then again, and then it was like, well, I don't know, there could have been a lot of scenarios, like what if she cheated? Or what if, like, all these things? Or what if she hit him first? I don't know.
Well, that was, yeah.
I'd be interested to know how, Sayra, right? Yeah. I'd be really interested to know how you interact with challenge nowadays in terms of being like a gay woman in this world that's rapidly changing, but still unfortunately has like a lot of these elements that are going to be offering a lot of like really wild pushback. I'd be really interested to know how you challenge that nowadays.
Well, I think we're all one big mirror of each other. And so sometimes, when people really say something to you, you got to think about like, okay, what is this person like carrying, or what are they bringing? Is it really directed towards me, or is it really that they're not educated? And so now I just kind of stop, and if I want to engage, I'll engage. If I don't, I don't. And I think ultimately being at peace with myself and being balanced, people are always going to talk, and as long as it doesn't affect me or if they don't disrespect me, I don't really care. And I'm comfortable with who I am. And I think it took me a really long time to get to where I'm at. And so I'm happy to say that I'm in this great place.
It's great to hear. Well, that's all the time we have for today for questions. We're going to go to our final statements right now. Yes. So, as we close this discussion, what do you feel are some of the most important messages, or almost like a call to action of, how you feel, people should sort of react today in this new age of evolving gender roles?
Honestly, I think be just very mindful of each other and everything. I don't know, just for example, in marriages, there's different things at work, and there's not necessarily gender roles or, just communication and respecting each other. And obviously we're still going to keep evolving, and with women having access to higher education and more money, there are going to be filling into different roles that, they didn't have access to before. And the same thing, there are a lot of men that are filling into roles that women were doing before, like nursing, hairstylist, doing eyelashes, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it makes him less of a man or less of a woman, vice versa. So I think just keep an open mind.
All right, thank you. Stephanie.
I think I just want to reiterate something that you've said a few times, which is about how important you think it is to respect yourself and to know yourself and to be comfortable in your own skin, because that kind of self-love and confidence is going to make it so much easier for us to go out into the world and love and respect other people, right? Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both.
Thank you, Garrett.
Thank you, Garrett.
Everyone, So our show is wrapping up to a close. I encourage you all to continue this conversation with your peers, your coworkers, the people in your life, because we're a part of, I believe, a movement that can spread, and we're a part of today something of just people who want to listen and expand more, even though we all come from different backgrounds. And I think that today's first episode of our show is the first in a long line, hopefully, of episodes where we can really, I guess, just bring openness to the world and heal as a society. So if you'd like any other inquiries or questions, please message my Instagram account at VettyFilms. Thank you all for joining us today, and please thank our guests, Sayra and Stephanie Spoto.
Thank you, baby girl.
Thank you, Garrett.
Thank you. All right, well, that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next week on VettyTalks.